At some point in most people's lives, there comes a moment of quiet reckoning, not the dramatic kind, not a crisis or a collapse or a rock-bottom story you could tell at a conference. Just a moment, usually ordinary, where you find yourself looking at the distance between where you are and where you thought you would be by now, and something in you gets very still. Maybe it is a Tuesday evening. Maybe you are sitting at a kitchen table going through numbers that refuse to cooperate. Maybe you are watching someone your age, someone who started from roughly where you started, talk about something they built, something they own, something they chose. And you realize with a clarity that is not entirely comfortable that the gap between you and them is not explained by luck or background or the particular cruelty of your circumstances. It is explained by decisions. Specifically, by a pattern of decisions that kept getting made in the same direction, justified by the same logic, dressed in language that sounded reasonable and even virtuous at the time. That language, for a significant portion of people raised with any kind of religious background, sounds something like this: I am trusting God with my finances. I am not going to chase money. Material things are not my priority. The Lord will provide. And here is the uncomfortable question, the one this piece is going to sit with for a while and refuse to let go of easily. How do you know when that is faith and when it is something else? How do you know when you are standing on genuine trust in a God who holds the future, and when you are standing on something that looks remarkably similar from the outside, but is actually much simpler and much older than theology? How do you know when you are practicing faith and when you are practicing avoidance, because the two feel almost identical from the inside? And that is the problem. Faith, as it is described throughout the ancient literature, not the sanitized version that gets preached at comfortable suburban congregations, but the actual friction-full, sweat and doubt version that runs through the texts. Faith has always been active. It has always cost something. It has always required the person exercising it to do something specific and often difficult, in the direction of a future they could not yet see. Noah did not sit in his living room and declare that God would build the ark if he really wanted one built. Abraham did not stay in Ur and wait for the land of promise to come to him. The Israelites in the wilderness received manna daily, but they had to go out and gather it every morning. The provision was real, and so was the requirement to show up and do the work of collecting it. Every major expression of faith in the entire biblical tradition is accompanied by movement, by risk, by the willingness to commit resources, time, energy, reputation, money, comfort to something that has not yet materialized because you believe it will. That is not passivity. That is one of the most demanding postures a human being can adopt, and it bears almost no resemblance to sitting still and calling the stillness holy. Financial laziness, by contrast, is exquisitely comfortable. It requires nothing. It asks you to make no difficult decisions, take no uncomfortable risks, learn nothing new, change nothing about your current habits or patterns or assumptions. And because it is uncomfortable to look at directly, because nobody wants to believe that what they are practicing is avoidance dressed in the language of trust, it needs a costume. It needs to be called something that sounds like virtue. And the most available costume for people with a religious background is faith, not because they are dishonest, but because the disguise is almost perfect. Both involve surrendering control. Both involve accepting uncertainty. Both involve, at least on the surface, not grasping anxiously after outcomes. The difference is not in the posture. The difference is in what is happening beneath the posture. The difference is in whether the surrender is a form of trust that frees you to act boldly, or a form of avoidance that prevents you from acting at all. There are signs. They are not always obvious, but they are there, and most people who are honest with themselves can recognize them. One sign is the relationship with planning. Faith, in every serious theological tradition, is compatible with planning. It is compatible with budgets, with 5-year goals, with investment strategies, with the kind of structured, patient, long-term thinking that characterizes every person who has ever built anything lasting. The biblical Joseph planned 7 years ahead for a famine he had only seen in a dream. Nehemiah, before he asked the king for permission to rebuild Jerusalem, had already worked out in his mind exactly what materials he would need, which routes he would travel, and how long the project would take. Planning is not the opposite of faith. The opposite of faith is fear. And one of fear's most reliable tactics is to disguise itself as trust, to convince you that making concrete plans is somehow an act of insufficient surrender, that the truly faithful person moves through life in a kind of permanent improvisation, trusting that things will work out without being specific about how or why or through whose effort. Another sign is the relationship with knowledge, specifically financial knowledge. The number of people who claim to trust God with their finances while simultaneously refusing to understand how money actually works is remarkable. They do not know what compound interest means. They have never opened an investment account. They have no idea what their net worth is or what it would need to be to produce the life they say they want. They treat financial literacy as though it was slightly worldly, as though understanding how money works was somehow at odds with being a person of faith. This is not piety. It is the intellectual equivalent of refusing to learn to read and calling it trust that God will communicate with you anyway. The person who asks for wisdom and then declines to acquire the knowledge that would make wisdom actionable is not trusting God. They are performing helplessness. And performance, however devout it looks, is not the same as faith. A third sign is the relationship with discomfort. Growth in any domain is uncomfortable. Learning new skills is uncomfortable. Starting a business is uncomfortable. Having the conversation with yourself about where your money has been going for the last 5 years is deeply uncomfortable. Changing patterns that have been in place for a long time, spending patterns, saving patterns, the reflexive way you respond when financial opportunity presents itself, is uncomfortable in the specific way that all genuine change is uncomfortable, which is to say, it feels wrong before it feels right. It feels like loss before it feels like gain. The person practicing faith tends to move through this discomfort because they have a reason larger than the discomfort itself. The person practicing financial laziness tends to stay on the near side of it, finding principled sounding reasons why now is not the right time, why the plan needs more thought, why the conditions are not yet ideal, why they are waiting for a sign. If any of this is landing somewhere real for you, consider subscribing. This channel exists for exactly these conversations, and there is a lot more where this came from. The waiting. This deserves its own examination, because it is the most seductive form the avoidance takes. Waiting feels spiritual. It has the texture of surrender, of humility, of not forcing things. And sometimes it genuinely is those things. The discernment between waiting that is wisdom and waiting that is fear dressed in robes is one of the genuinely hard questions of a life lived with any seriousness. But there are clues. Wisdom waiting tends to be active during the wait, gathering information, preparing, building the skills and resources that will be needed when the moment comes. Fear waiting tends to be still in a way that looks like peace, but feels, underneath, like paralysis. Wisdom waiting has a direction and a time frame, even if both are provisional. Fear waiting is indefinite by design, because the indefiniteness is the point. If the wait has no end condition, if there is no specific thing you are looking for, no moment of adequate preparation after which you will act, then the wait is not a strategy, it is an exit, a permanent deferral that never has to be called what it is, because it is always just about to end. And here is where the theology becomes personal in a way that is hard to sidestep. Because if you believe, genuinely believe, not as a cultural habit but as a working assumption about how reality is structured, that you were made intentionally by a God who placed specific gifts and capacities inside you, then what you do with those gifts and capacities is not a neutral matter. It is not something you can set aside with a prayer and a shrug. The parable of the talents is not gentle on this point. The servant who received 1 talent and buried it was not condemned for losing it. He was condemned for doing nothing with it, for letting the gap between fear and action remain unresolved indefinitely, for choosing the safety of inaction over the risk of engagement, and the master's response is worth sitting with. He does not comfort the servant or try to understand his anxiety. He calls the decision what it is, not caution, not wisdom, not faith, and he removes from the servant the very thing he was too afraid to use. There is a version of this conversation that goes in the direction of guilt, and that is not where this needs to land. Guilt is not useful here. Most people who have been living the pattern described in these pages have not been doing so out of laziness in any straightforward sense of that word. They have been doing so out of fear that was learned young and ran deep, in many cases compounded by real obstacles and genuine hardship and the kind of systemic disadvantage that makes building wealth legitimately harder for some people than for others. All of that is real. None of it is dismissed here, but it is also true. And this is the part that requires honesty, that real obstacles do not explain the full distance between where most people are and where they could be. Part of the explanation for that distance is the pattern of waiting, the pattern of knowing what you should do and not doing it, the pattern of dressing inaction in theological language because it is more dignified than admitting you are afraid. The path forward does not begin with a financial plan, though eventually it will require one. It begins with a question. A simple, uncomfortable, private question that you ask yourself in the quiet, not for anyone else's benefit, not to answer out loud, just to answer honestly. Am I waiting because I am trusting, or am I waiting because I am afraid? And then a second question, equally simple and equally hard. What is the smallest, most concrete step I could take today? Not when conditions are better, not when I feel more ready, not when the sign arrives. What could I do today that moves me one increment in the direction of the life I say I want? Because faith does not look like a person standing still while their life waits for permission to begin. It looks like a person in motion, often uncertain, sometimes afraid, taking the next step anyway, because they have decided that the God who made them would not have placed inside them a capacity for more, and then intended for them to do nothing with it. It looks like a person who understands that the miracle most of the time meets them in the movement, who understands that the manna appears after you go out to gather, that the water flows after you strike the rock, that the way opens after you step into the river, not before. The difference between faith and financial laziness is not a theological technicality. It is the difference between a life spent building and a life spent waiting for a construction crew that was never coming because you were always the one who was supposed to show up. It is the difference between leaving something behind for the people who come after you and arriving at the end of your story with exactly what you started with, intact and untouched and completely useless. The talent was not given to be kept safe. It was given to be multiplied. And every day that passes without you using it is not a day of faithful waiting. It is a day of the ground getting a little deeper and the talent getting a little harder to find.